Hello and welcome back. I am glad you're here tonight. It is 6 in the morning on the 19th of July, 1821, and a woman in a formal gown is stepping out of a carriage in front of Westminster Hall. The light is already full. It is midsummer in London, and the sun has been up for more than an hour, and the stone of the old hall is pale and warm in it. There are people everywhere, thousands of them, gathered along the streets and pressed against the railings, waiting for a coronation that will not begin for hours yet. The woman walks toward the nearest door. She is 53 years old. Her name is Caroline, and she is, by every law that governs this country, the Queen of England. She has been queen for 18 months. She has never been crowned. She has never been permitted inside the palace. She has not spoken to her husband in 25 years. At the door, a guard asks her for her ticket. She tells him she is the Queen and that she does not need one. He tells her she cannot enter. She moves to the next door and the next. At one of them, she calls out, "The Queen, open," and the pages on the other side briefly obey. For a moment the door swings inward, and behind it there is candlelight and colour and the sound of 700 people arranging themselves for a ceremony she was meant to be part of. Then an official steps forward and says, "Do your duty. Shut the door." They shut it. She will be dead in 19 days. Most people who know this story at all remember it as a bad royal marriage, a prince who married for money, a wife he could not stand. All of that is true. But the part that gets lost is that the man who ordered every door shut against her that morning had already been secretly married to someone else, 10 years before Caroline ever arrived in England. Parliament had been told the marriage never happened. The woman he called his true wife outlived them both. If these quiet histories help your evening feel slower, a subscribe would mean a great deal to me. And if you feel like it, leave a word in the comments about where you're listening from tonight and what the hour is where you are. I always read them. So let whatever light is still on go a little lower. Let your shoulders settle. We're going back to a small German court in 1768, and we will take it slowly. The court at Brunswick was a small one, as European courts went. A ducal palace, a formal calendar of receptions and seasonal balls, a staff of livery servants in powdered wigs who moved through corridors that smelled of beeswax and wood smoke. The fires were lit with birch and beech, not coal, and the light in the staterooms came from beeswax candles that burned clean and without odour, which was a luxury even in a palace, because most candles in this period were made of rendered animal fat and smelled, faintly but persistently, of mutton. It was into this world that Caroline Amelia Elizabeth was born on the 17th of May, 1768. She was the daughter of Charles William Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, and Princess Augusta of Great Britain. Augusta was the eldest sister of King George III of England. That made Caroline a princess of a minor German state, a niece of the British king, and, though nobody would have thought to mention it at the time, a first cousin of the man she would one day be forced to marry. She would not meet him until 3 days before the wedding. She would not hear his voice until the same afternoon. And the portrait that was sent to Brunswick to show her what he looked like bore, by every account that survives, almost no resemblance to the man who would be standing at the altar. I keep coming back to that portrait. It is the first lie in the sequence, and it is the one she held in her hands. Caroline grew up in a household that was, in its own quiet way, a rehearsal for what was coming. Her father, the Duke, maintained a permanent mistress at the Brunswick court. This was not hidden. It was not even particularly unusual by the standards of 18th century European aristocracy. But it was constant, and it was visible, and it shaped the air inside the palace in ways that had nothing to do with candle smoke or firewood. The ducal apartments were arranged along a single corridor on the upper floor. Caroline's mother occupied the rooms at one end. The Duke's mistress was installed, more or less permanently, at the other. Between them, the formal reception rooms carried on their seasonal business, the balls, the dinners, the presentations of visiting dignitaries, as though none of this were happening. The servants moved through all of it without comment. Caroline moved through it too, as a child, and then as a girl, and then as a young woman who had absorbed, without anyone teaching her, the understanding that a marriage could be a public performance and a private catastrophe at the same time. For Caroline's mother, Augusta, a princess of England, a woman who had been raised to expect that the public appearance of a marriage would at least be maintained, the arrangement was a source of sustained and well-documented anger. It was the anger of a woman who had done everything that was asked of her and received, in return, a rival installed at the other end of her own hallway. The household was not a home in the way that word usually means. It was two adults conducting separate lives under the same ornamental roof, with their children moved back and forth between them, according to no fixed pattern that the historical record can identify. Caroline was raised with what contemporaries described as a considerable degree of personal freedom, which is the diplomatic way of saying that nobody was paying close enough attention. She spoke freely, sometimes too freely. She had what one observer later called unrestrained speech, which could be perceived as vulgar or lacking in respect, particularly toward her mother. The consequence of all this was specific. The court at Brunswick produced a young woman who'd been trained in the forms of dynastic presentation, the dresses, the curtsies, the formal languages, the business of getting into a formal gown with the help of a lady's maid, which could take 45 minutes to an hour for a full court occasion, but who had never seen a marriage that worked, and who had developed, in the absence of consistent supervision, a habit of saying exactly what she thought. In a minor German duchy that was an eccentricity. In the court of George III it would become a weapon used against her for the rest of her life. By 1794, Caroline was 26 years old and still unmarried. There had been proposals, there had been negotiations. There had been, according to some accounts, a rumoured attachment to a man of lower station whom her father would not permit her to marry. None of it had come to anything. She was, by the narrow standards of the European marriage market, running out of time. And then a letter arrived from England. The letter concerned her cousin George, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne. He was 32 years old. He was by that point the most indebted man in England who was not actually in prison for it. His debt stood at somewhere between £630,000 and £660,000, a figure so large that it resists translation into anything the mind can hold, but which can be understood this way. A skilled craftsman in England in 1795 earned roughly £50 to £80 a year. The Prince of Wales owed more than 8,000 years of that man's wages. He owed it to tailors, to wine merchants, to the gambling tables at which he'd been losing steadily since his early 20s, and above all to the architects who'd been rebuilding and refurnishing Carlton House for more than a decade. Carlton House was a mansion on Pall Mall that George had been given at the age of 21, and which he had immediately begun to transform into something closer to Versailles. The renovation involved French furniture, Italian marble, gilded ceilings, and a staff whose wages alone could have sustained several comfortable households. The house consumed money the way a furnace consumes coal, and it was never finished, because the prince's taste changed faster than the builders could follow it. The consequence of this was not abstract. By 1794, the debts were large enough to threaten the political stability of the monarchy itself. A prince who could not pay his creditors was a prince who could be embarrassed in public, and a prince who could be embarrassed in public was a liability to the crown. His father, King George III, had made his position clear. Parliament would consider settling the debts and increasing the prince's annual allowance by an additional £65,000 a year, on one condition. He must marry. He must marry a bride approved by the crown, and he must produce a legitimate heir. The arrangement was, in its essentials, a transaction. The Prince of Wales would receive money. In exchange, he would consent to a marriage he did not want, with a woman he had never met, in a country she had never visited. That was the offer. That was the shape of it. What the offer did not mention, what nobody in Brunswick was told, and what Parliament itself had been formally assured was not the case, was that the Prince of Wales was in a meaningful sense already married. On the 15th of December, 1785, in a private ceremony at her home in Mayfair, George had married a woman named Maria Ann Fitzherbert. She was Catholic. She was a widow twice over. She was 6 years older than him, and the ceremony, conducted by an Anglican clergyman named Robert Burt, who had been persuaded to officiate in exchange for the settlement of his own debts, was illegal under not one but two Acts of Parliament. The first was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which stated that no descendant of King George II could contract a valid marriage without the sovereign's prior consent. George III had not consented. He had not been asked. The second was the Act of Settlement of 1701, which prohibited the monarch or their heir from marrying a Roman Catholic. Maria Fitzherbert was a practicing Catholic. Under civil law, the marriage was void. Under the law of the Catholic Church, it was entirely binding. There is a particular kind of absurdity in a law that exists because a king was embarrassed by his own brothers. The Royal Marriages Act had been passed because two of George III's younger siblings had married without his knowledge, one to a widow, the other to a commoner, and the resulting scandal had mortified the crown. George III's solution was to make it illegal for any of his descendants to marry without the sovereign's consent, ever, under any circumstances, for all time. And the first person to break the law he had created to prevent exactly this sort of thing was his own eldest son. George knew the marriage was void. Maria knew it too, though she regarded it as sacramentally valid, which it was, in the eyes of the church she belonged to. When rumours of the union threatened to derail the prince's financial negotiations with Parliament, his political allies stood up in the House of Commons and denied it had ever taken place. The denial was public, it was parliamentary, and it was a lie. George had authorised it. Maria had not been consulted. She would outlive him. She would outlive Caroline. She would outlive almost every person who appears in this story. Maria Fitzherbert died in 1837, at the age of 80, in Brighton, in the house George had given her decades earlier. He had continued to visit her intermittently throughout his marriage to Caroline. He referred to her, in private letters and in conversation with those he trusted, as his true wife. On his deathbed, he was found to be wearing a miniature portrait of her around his neck. That is the man for whom the portrait was sent to Brunswick, and that is the man Caroline was looking at, in a painted miniature that made him look slimmer, younger, and considerably more sober than he was. What was she supposed to do with a portrait like that? The marriage, when it came, was not a question of whether Caroline wanted it. Under the law of both England and Brunswick, a woman in her position had almost no independent legal standing. English law at this time operated under the doctrine of coverture, which held that upon marriage, A woman's legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not own property independently, and she had no legal right to her own children. What this meant, in the rooms and corridors of an actual marriage, was this. A father's custody was effectively absolute, and could be exercised without explanation, without appeal, and without limit. He decided where the children lived, who taught them, who visited them, and when, if ever, their mother could see them. He did not need to justify any of this to anyone. The law assumed he was acting in the children's interest, because the law assumed that a father always was. If the marriage failed, Caroline could apply to the church courts for a legal separation, a divorcium immensa et thoro, a separation from bed and board. But this dissolved nothing. She could not remarry. He could restrict her access to her children at will, and a full divorce, the kind that permitted remarriage, required a private act of Parliament which was available only to the very wealthy, and in practice only to men, and in practice only to men whose wives had committed adultery, not the other way around. The legal costs alone were enough to make the process inaccessible to all but the richest families in the country. This was the legal architecture that Caroline was walking into. She did not know about Maria Fitzherbert. She did not know about the debts, or not their true scale. She knew what the portrait showed her, and what the formal correspondence told her, and what her mother, who had spent 30 years watching her own husband keep a mistress at court, had negotiated on her behalf. Some of the contemporaries who saw Caroline before she left Brunswick described her in terms that have not survived into the popular version of this story. She had, according to one account, expressive eyes, flaxen hair, teeth as white as ivory, and a pleasing figure. She was described as short, which she was, below the middling stature, in the language of the time. She dressed in the light muslin and fine silk that was fashionable across Europe in the 1790s, the high-waisted empire silhouette that flowed from just below the bust and offered almost no protection against the cold. It was a style designed for drawing rooms, not for the weather of northern Germany, and certainly not for the English Channel crossing that was about to come. The descriptions that have dominated popular history, that she was fat, coarse, and unwashed, come almost entirely from sources connected to the Prince of Wales, written after the marriage had failed, and repeated so often that they replace the earlier accounts entirely. This is not a small point. The physical description of Caroline that most people carry in their heads was composed, in large part, by the household of the man who needed to justify having rejected her. The hostile version arrived later. It arrived louder, and because it was more dramatic, and because it confirmed the story that the Prince of Wales wanted told, it was the version that survived. I find that worth pausing on. The earlier descriptions suggest something simpler and more ordinary. A young woman from a minor court, reasonably attractive by the standards of the day, who spoke too freely and had never seen a marriage succeed, preparing to cross the sea to meet a man whose portrait she had been studying for weeks. The woman who was later called vulgar was at this point simply nervous. The woman who was called unwashed was at this point packing her trunks in a palace that smelled of beeswax and clean linen. The portrait was a fiction. The debts were real. The secret marriage was still technically in effect in every way except the one that mattered under English civil law. And the woman in Brunswick holding the painted miniature of a man she had never met had no way of knowing any of it. She packed her things. She said goodbye to the court that smelled of beeswax and birch smoke, and she boarded a ship for England, where the man in the portrait was waiting, not for her exactly, but for the money that marrying her would release. The portrait crossed the Channel with her. It was in her things, somewhere among the trunks and the formal gowns and the letters of introduction that had been prepared by her mother's household. She had studied it for weeks, in the rooms at Brunswick, by candlelight and by window light, turning it in her hands to see how the paint caught the different angles. She knew the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, the powdered hair arranged in the style of the English court. The miniature showed a man who looked, by the conventions of formal portraiture, presentable, slender, dignified, sober. What she did not know, and could not have known, was that the portrait had been painted several years and several stone earlier, and that the man waiting for her in London no longer looked much like it. The Channel crossing itself was rough. April is not a kind month on that stretch of water, and the war with France had made civilian shipping riskier than usual. The ship pitched and rolled for days. Caroline was seasick. She arrived not as the formal miniature of a princess that Brunswick had prepared, but as a woman who had been at sea in bad weather for the better part of a week, and who was stepping onto a dock in a country where she knew almost no one and spoke the language imperfectly. Caroline arrived at Greenwich on the 5th of April 1795. She arrived on a cold, damp, grey English afternoon, the kind that turns stone dark and makes the river smell stronger than it should. The dock at Greenwich sat below the Royal Naval Hospital, a complex of grand colonnaded buildings that must have looked, from the water, like a palace in its own right. The hospital's pensioners, retired sailors, some of them missing limbs, most of them elderly, all of them in the dark blue coats of the naval establishment, were lined along the waterfront to receive her. Some of them had fought in the wars that Caroline's own father had commanded in Germany. None of them knew who she was beyond the title. The air carried the smell of tar and rope and river water, the permanent atmosphere of any working dock on the Thames. The wooden pilings were slick with it. The stone quay was wet from the drizzle that had been falling since morning. And through the damp and the cold and the unfamiliar smell of a river she had never seen came the sound of the formal guns that marked her arrival, a ceremonial salute that echoed off the hospital buildings and scattered the gulls from the roofline. It was a welcome designed for a future queen. It was also entirely impersonal. The man she was here to marry was not among the people waiting. Caroline stepped off the ship and onto English soil for the first time in her life. She was wearing her best travelling clothes. She'd been at sea for days. She looked at the rows of naval veterans, at the grey water behind her, at the formal party that had been assembled to escort her to London, and she asked a question. The question, according to the account that survives, was simple. She asked which of the men present was the prince. None of them was. The Prince of Wales had not come to Greenwich to meet his bride. He had not sent a member of the royal family. He had sent in his place a delegation led by Lord Malmesbury, the diplomat who had negotiated the marriage in Brunswick, a man Caroline already knew, and who was now visibly uncomfortable. And he had sent one other person, whose presence was not accidental and was not kind. Frances Villiers, Countess of Jersey, had been appointed Lady of the Bedchamber to Caroline before Caroline had even arrived in England. The appointment was George's doing. Lady Jersey was 42 years old, a grandmother, poised and sharp and entirely at ease in the world of the English court in a way that Caroline was not and could never have been. She was the Prince of Wales's current mistress. Her role, officially, was to attend the princess, manage her wardrobe, and supervise her household staff. Her role, in practice, was to be present, visibly, constantly, inescapably present, in Caroline's daily life, from the moment she set foot on English ground. What this meant in practice was that the first English woman Caroline spent any significant time with was a woman who did not want her there. Lady Jersey controlled access to the wardrobe. Lady Jersey managed the schedule. Lady Jersey decided which servants attended the princess and at what hours. She was, in effect, the gatekeeper of Caroline's own household, and she answered not to Caroline but to the man who had appointed her, the man Caroline was about to marry. The appointment was not a secret, and it was not subtle. Everyone at court knew who Lady Jersey was and what she was to the prince. The fact that she'd been placed inside Caroline's own household was understood by those who understood such things as a message. The message was that this marriage would be conducted on the prince's terms, in the prince's way, and that the woman he actually wanted would be standing in the room while it happened. I have read that appointment described as an insult. It was not an insult. An insult is careless. This was architecture. The carriage that took Caroline from Greenwich to St. James's Palace was a formal coach, painted wood and iron, with leather-upholstered seats and velvet cushioning. The roads between Greenwich and central London were cobblestoned, and at speed the iron-rimmed wheels on the stone produced a constant clatter that made conversation difficult. Lady Jersey sat opposite her for the entire journey. Lord Malmesbury sat beside her. The carriage moved through a London that Caroline had never seen, past buildings and streets and crowds that she could hear more than she could study, because the noise of the wheels on the cobbles filled the interior and made the city a thing felt through the body, rather than seen through the glass. At St. James's Palace, in a room panelled in dark wood and hung with tapestries that had been there for generations, the Prince of Wales finally met his bride for the first time. He had not been waiting eagerly. He had not been waiting at all. He had been elsewhere in the palace, and when he was informed that she had arrived, he came to the room where she was standing. The first words he spoke were not to Caroline, they were to Lord Malmesbury. The Prince of Wales looked at the woman he was contracted to marry in 3 days, turned to the diplomat who had arranged it, and said, according to Malmesbury's own diary, "Harris, I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He then left the room. Caroline, still standing where she'd been presented, watched him go. The room was quiet after he left. The dark wood panelling absorbed what little light came through the windows, and the tapestries on the walls, hunting scenes, pastoral landscapes, the conventional decoration of a palace that had not been redecorated in decades, hung motionless in air that smelled of dust and old fabric, and the faint trace of the brandy that had just been called for. She turned to Malmesbury and said something that the diary also records, though historians have translated it differently. The gist of it was this: is the prince always like that? Malmesbury, who had spent months in Brunswick assuring her that the marriage would go well, did not answer directly. He could not have answered honestly without undoing every assurance he had ever given her. The brandy was brought in a cut-glass tumbler, the kind of heavy facetted glassware that was standard in a palace of this period. The prince drank it in another room. He did not return for some time. When he did, the conversation was stiff and brief, and Caroline was left with the impression, correct as it turned out, that this man did not want to be married to her, had never wanted to be married to her, and regarded the entire arrangement as humiliation he had been forced to accept in exchange for the settlement of his debts. There is a version of this scene that is often told as comedy: the fat prince and the smelly princess, two ridiculous people failing to like each other. I do not think that is what happened in that room. What happened was that a woman who had crossed the sea on the strength of a painted portrait and a set of diplomatic assurances, walked into a dark panelled room and discovered, in the space of 30 seconds, that every part of the arrangement she had been sold was a fiction. The man did not look like the portrait. The man did not want to be in the room. The man's mistress was standing behind her. And the portrait, the one she had carried across the channel, the one she'd studied in Brunswick, was now useless, because the face it showed her was a face that no longer existed. The wedding took place 3 days later, on the 8th of April 1795, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. 3 days. In that time, Caroline and George had been in the same room on perhaps 2 occasions, and neither had gone well. The first meeting had ended with brandy and a closed door. The second, a formal dinner, had been no better. George had spoken mostly to Lady Jersey, who sat at the table as though she belonged there, which in every practical sense she did. The Chapel Royal was a small, ornate space. Gold leaf on the ceiling, painted panels depicting biblical scenes, candlelight multiplied by the mirrors that lined the walls, and threw the flames back across the room in long, warm lines. The candles were beeswax, not tallow, and the room smelled of wax and incense and the particular mineral warmth that old stone gives off when it has been closed and heated for hours. It was, by any standard, a beautiful room. It was not a large one. Everyone in it could see everyone else, and what everyone could see on the evening of the 8th of April was that the Prince of Wales was drunk. He had been drinking since the afternoon. He was visibly unsteady. According to at least one account, he had to be physically supported during parts of the ceremony, and at one point appeared close to falling. The king, seated in his place, watched without expression. The Queen watched without expression. The assembled court, dressed in their best and arranged according to precedence in a room where the back rows were close enough to smell the front ones, watched without expression. It was the collective silence of people who know what they are seeing and have decided as a group not to see it. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who conducted the service, paused at the line in the liturgy that asks whether any person knows of a lawful impediment to the marriage. He paused, and he looked directly at the prince, and he looked at the king. The pause, according to accounts written afterward, was longer than it should have been. It was the pause of a man who knew something or suspected something, and who was giving the room one last chance to speak. Nobody spoke. The ceremony continued. The impediment, of course, existed. Maria Fitzherbert was alive and well and living in London, less than a mile from where this ceremony was taking place. The marriage that Parliament had been told never happened had happened, in a drawing-room in Mayfair 10 years earlier. The clergyman who performed it had been paid with the settlement of his debts, and the bride, standing now in the Chapel Royal in a gown she'd been dressed in over the course of an hour that morning, surrounded by candlelight and gold and the silent complicity of every person in the room, had no idea that any of it was true. That night, the wedding night, George wrote his will. It was not a will prompted by illness or by any reasonable expectation of death. It was a will prompted by the marriage itself, and it contained a single extraordinary provision. He left everything he possessed to Maria Fitzherbert, whom he described in the document as his true wife. To Caroline, the woman he had married that afternoon in the Chapel Royal, before the Archbishop and the King and 700 witnesses, he left 1 shilling. 1 shilling. Roughly the cost of a meal in a coaching inn, or a cheap seat at the theatre. It was not an oversight. It was the minimum required by law to prevent the will from being challenged on grounds of omission. He had included her precisely enough to exclude her, and he had done it on the night of the wedding, in the same palace where the ceremony had taken place, while the candles were still lit. 9 months later, almost to the day, on the 7th of January 1796, Caroline gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Charlotte Augusta, Princess Charlotte of Wales. She was born in Carlton House, the same house that George's debts had built and rebuilt again, in a room that had been prepared for the purpose and that Caroline would not occupy for much longer. The birth was attended by physicians and by members of the court, as royal births were required to be, and when it was over, and the child was confirmed to be healthy, and the sex was confirmed to be female, the political calculation shifted. A daughter was not what Parliament had hoped for. A son would have settled the succession cleanly. A daughter was an heir presumptive, not an heir apparent. She could be displaced by a future son if one were ever born. But George, having secured what Parliament required of him, a marriage and a legitimate heir, even if the heir was female, effectively ended the marriage within weeks of Charlotte's birth. He informed Caroline by letter that he considered their obligations to each other fulfilled. He would not share her bed again. He would not share her household. He would decide where Charlotte lived, who raised her, and when, if ever, her mother would be permitted to see her. The letter was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the language of a man who understood that the law was entirely on his side, and that nothing Caroline could do or say would change any of it. The Coverture law that has been an abstraction in Brunswick was now a daily fact. Caroline had no legal standing to challenge any of it. The child was his, under law, in every sense that mattered. The house was his. The staff was his. The right to determine who entered the nursery was his. Caroline could visit her own daughter only when George permitted it, and George permitted it rarely. The visits, when they happened, were supervised. There was always someone in the room, watching, reporting back. The nursery itself, warm, well-staffed, furnished with everything a princess required, was a room that Caroline could enter only as a guest in her own child's life. And Lady Jersey, the woman who'd been waiting at the dock, who had sat opposite her in the carriage, who had stood behind her at the first meeting and beside her through the wedding, Lady Jersey was still there, still appointed, still present in the household that was no longer Caroline's in anything but name. Within 3 years Lady Jersey would be gone, replaced as George's mistresses tended to be, by someone younger. But the principle she represented would remain. There would always be someone watching. There would always be someone placed inside Caroline's life who answered to George rather than to her. The surveillance was not personal, it was structural, and it would follow her out of London, across the Thames, to a house on an open heath where she would spend the next decade trying to build a life that nobody had given her permission to have. Lady Jersey left the household in 1797. She was not missed, but she was not replaced by nothing. What replaced her was a different kind of watching, less visible, less personal, and in the end far more damaging. The woman who would eventually take on that role lived next door, and her name was Lady Douglas, and when she arrived in Caroline's life she came not as a rival or a spy but as a friend. That friendship and what it became belongs to this stretch of heath, and to this house, and to these years, and it is worth seeing clearly how it started because it started well. Caroline moved to Montague House on the edge of Blackheath in 1797. The house was a modest country residence by the standards of what she might have expected. Brick-built, set back from the road, with a garden that ran down toward the open heath. The rooms were small by comparison with anything she'd known in Brunswick or in London. The ceilings were lower, The corridors were narrower. The fireplaces, though adequate, heated the rooms unevenly, and the draughts from the heath came in through the window frames on cold nights and made the candles gutter. It was not a palace. It was not grand. It was, in every material sense, a step down from the life she had been promised when she crossed the Channel. But it was the first place in England she could call, with some qualification, her own. The house came with a small staff, a garden, a view of the heath that stretched for miles, and, most importantly, as there's no Lady Jersey in it, for the first time since her arrival in England, Caroline woke up in the morning in a house where nobody was watching her on George's behalf, or so she believed. Blackheath itself was open heathland south of Greenwich, high ground with long views across the river toward London, crossed by chalk and gravel footpaths that wound through scrub and grass and low wind-bent trees. The wind was constant. On an autumn evening, with the light going and the heath stretching out dark and flat in every direction, the sound of it was the only sound there was, a low, steady pressure against the walls of the house that made the rooms inside feel smaller and quieter than they were. At night, with no city light for miles, the sky above the heath was thick with stars, and the observatory at Greenwich, visible from Caroline's windows, sat on the hill like a lantern in a field. It was not what she'd been raised for. It was not what she'd crossed the sea to become, but it was hers, or as close to hers as the law would permit, and Caroline set about making it into something. The Crown appointed her Ranger of Greenwich Park. The title sounded ceremonial, and in many respects it was. The Ranger was responsible for the maintenance and oversight of the park, its deer herd, its formal gardens, its pathways and boundaries. The deer were fallow deer, a herd that had been maintained in the park since the 16th century, and they grazed the formal lawns and wandered the avenues of chestnut trees that led up to the observatory. Managing them was not decorative work. It meant overseeing the culling, the fencing, the feeding, in hard winters when the grass was gone and the ground was frozen solid. But the role came with a residence and a small income, and more importantly it came with a degree of official standing that Caroline had not had since the separation. She was no longer simply a discarded wife living in a borrowed house. She was the Ranger, with duties, with a park, with a reason to be seen in public that did not depend on George's goodwill. For a woman whose legal identity had been absorbed into that of a man who refused to acknowledge her, the title was not trivial. It was the only official thing she was. She took the role seriously. She walked the park. She involved herself in its management in ways that the previous rangers, men, all of them, and most of them absent, had not bothered with. She ordered repairs to the chalk and gravel pathways that wound through the grounds. She had the grounds around Montague House improved. She had a bathhouse built, a small classical structure in the garden that she designed herself, or at least directed, and that was finished in plaster and paint whose smell lingered in the rooms of the main house for weeks after. The bathhouse was, by royal standards, a minor indulgence. By the standards of the separated wife whose husband had left her 1 shilling in his will, it was something close to defiance. I find I admire her for the bathhouse, not for the building itself, which was small and is now gone, but for the fact of it, the decision to improve a house that was not quite hers, in a life that was not quite permitted, as though she intended to stay. And why not? Who else was going to build it for her? And she made Montague House into something that it had never been before, and that no one expected it to become. She began to entertain, not the stiff, formal receptions of the court. She had no court and no standing to hold one, but informal gatherings, dinners, evenings of conversation and music that drew in a surprising range of guests. Artists came, politicians came, naval officers from the hospital at Greenwich came, walking up the hill from the river in their dress uniforms, glad of a dinner invitation from anyone, let alone a princess. George Canning, who would one day be Prime Minister, came. The painter Thomas Lawrence came. The house on the edge of the heath, which should have been a place of quiet exile, became instead one of the more interesting drawing rooms in the south of England. The evenings had a quality that the court at St. James's did not: informality, warmth, the sense that the woman at the head of the table was actually interested in what her guests had to say. The food was generous, the wine was good. Caroline sat at the centre of it, talking too much, laughing too loudly, asking questions that a more cautious woman would have left unasked, and creating, for a few hours at a time, on a heath at the edge of London, the kind of household she might have run if she'd been given the chance to run one properly. The consequence of all this was double. On the one hand, it gave Caroline a life. On the other, it gave her enemies material. Every guest was noted. Every evening was reported. The informality that made Montague House worth visiting was the same informality that would, in time, be used against her. She behaved in the assessment of her critics as though she did not understand that she was still being watched. She was still being watched. Lady Douglas had moved to Blackheath with her husband Sir John Douglas in the early years of the new century. She was a neighbour. She became a regular visitor. She and Caroline spent time together. Walks on the heath in the afternoons, when the wind was at their backs and the gravel paths ran straight toward the river. Dinners at Montague House in the evenings. The easy intimacy of two women living in close proximity with time on their hands and not enough to fill it. The walks were the foundation of it. Two women on an open heath, with nobody to overhear them, talking freely about the things that women in their positions talked about: husbands, households, children, the daily texture of lives that were shaped by men who were mostly absent. Caroline trusted her. Caroline talked freely in front of her, as she talked freely in front of most people, because Caroline had never learned to do otherwise, and because nobody had ever given her a reason to learn. She told Lady Douglas things about her marriage, about George, about the arrangements that had been forced upon her, that a more cautious woman would have kept to herself. What Lady Douglas heard during those visits she kept, and what she thought she saw she would later report. Around 1802, Caroline took a child into her household. His name was William Austin. He was the son of a dockworker's family. His mother, Sophia Austin, had worked at the Naval Hospital at Greenwich, and his father was a labourer on the docks, and Caroline brought him into Montague House and raised him as though he were her own. She did not adopt him formally. She did not conceal his origins. She simply took him in, gave him a room in the upper part of the house, gave him a place at the table, dressed him well, and treated him with the kind of open physical affection that she had not been allowed to show to her own daughter. William was a small child, 3 or 4 years old when he arrived, and Caroline carried him on her hip, kissed him in front of guests, sat him on her lap during dinner parties, and referred to him with a warmth that several visitors noted, and that at least one found excessive. He called her by a pet name. She called him her little boy. The household staff accepted his presence without comment, because the princess had decided it, and the princess's decisions were not questioned in her own house, the only place in England where that was true. Charlotte was still alive. Charlotte was still in London, in the nurseries that George controlled, growing up under the supervision of governesses and tutors that Caroline had no say in choosing. Caroline was permitted to see her occasionally under conditions that were always supervised and never sufficient. The child she was not allowed to mother was less than 10 miles away. The child she chose to mother was sleeping under her roof. There is a reading of this that makes Caroline look reckless, and perhaps she was. Taking in a child of unknown parentage in her position with her enemies watching was not cautious. But I think there is a simpler reading, and it is the one that stays with me. She wanted a child in the house. She could not have her own. She took one in. The politics of it were something she either did not consider or chose not to care about, and in either case the result was the same. Lady Douglas cared about the politics of it very much. By 1805 the friendship had soured. The reasons are disputed, and the accounts contradict each other. And Lady Douglas went to the Duke of Cumberland, who went to the King, with a set of accusations that would have destroyed Caroline if they had been believed. The central claim was that William Austin was not a charity case. He was, Lady Douglas alleged, Caroline's own child, conceived in adultery, born in secret, and smuggled into the household as a foundling. The accusation was explosive. If true, it meant the Princess of Wales had committed high treason. Under the Treason Act of 1351, adultery by the wife of the heir to the throne was a capital offence. It was not a metaphor. It was not a social disgrace. It carried in law the penalty of death. In 1806, the government convened what became known as the Delicate Investigation, a secret commission of 4 senior politicians appointed by the King to examine the charges against Caroline in private. The commissioners met behind closed doors, in rooms that Caroline was not permitted to enter. She was not told the specific allegations until they had already been examined. She was not allowed to confront her accusers. The proceedings were, in every procedural sense, a trial from which the defendant had been excluded. They interviewed Lady Douglas, who repeated and expanded her claims. They interviewed the servants at Montague House, the cook, the housemaids, the footmen, the women who had attended Caroline in her private rooms, and asked them what they had seen, what they had heard, and whether anything in the household had struck them as unusual. Some of the servants were loyal, some were not. All of them understood that the questions were not casual. They examined the birth records of William Austin and traced his parentage to his actual mother, Sophia Austin, whose pregnancy and delivery were documented by the attending physician and by the parish records of Deptford. The Commission's findings were clear. William Austin was not Caroline's child. The charge of high treason was baseless. The investigation confirmed his origins, confirmed the dates, confirmed the names, and dismissed the central allegation entirely. But the Commission also noted, carefully, diplomatically, in language designed to leave a mark without drawing blood, that Caroline's conduct at Montague House had been, in their view, unwise. The parties, the informality, the freedom with which she spoke and behaved, the way she held William Austin on her lap, the way she kissed him, the way she allowed herself to be seen in the company of men who were not her relatives. None of this was criminal. All of it was recorded, and all of it would resurface 14 years later in a different proceeding, in a different chamber, when the same kind of evidence would be used to try to end her marriage by Act of Parliament. The Delicate Investigation did not destroy Caroline. It did something more precise than that. It established in writing, in the files of the government, that she was a woman who could be investigated, that her household was a place where allegations could be generated, examined, and, even when they failed, used to narrow the boundaries of what she was permitted to do. The investigation cleared her of the worst charge and buried her under the weight of everything else. Montague House continued, Caroline continued, William Austen continued to sleep under her roof, to eat at her table, to call her by a name that was not mother but functioned as one. And Charlotte, the daughter who was legally hers and practically unreachable, continued to grow up in London in rooms that Caroline was allowed to enter only by appointment, under the gaze of people who reported everything she said to the man who had written her out of his will on the night of their wedding, the child she kept and the child she was not allowed to keep. That is the shape of these years, and it is the shape that would follow her, eventually across the sea to Italy, where the distance between herself and her daughter would become not 10 miles but 1,000, and where the news she feared most would arrive not by letter from a husband, but from a stranger on a road. In 1814 Caroline left England. She did not announce this as a permanent departure. She said she was travelling, but she took William Austen with her, and she did not come back for 6 years, and the manner of her leaving, quietly, without ceremony, without any formal acknowledgment from the Crown, made it clear that England was relieved to see her go. She crossed the Channel and moved south. She travelled through Germany, through Switzerland, through the kind of slow, wandering European journey that wealthy English people took when they wanted to be somewhere that was not England. By 1815 she had settled at the Villa d'Este on the western shore of Lake Como, in the foothills of the Italian Alps. The villa was a lakeside estate with formal gardens, stone terraces, and a view across the water to mountains that were still white with snow in June. The air was warm in a way that England never was. The summers on the lake were long and soft and full of light, and the winters, by comparison with the cold damp of Blackheath, the wind on the heath, the candles guttering in the draught, were mild enough that a woman who had spent years in an English house with uneven fireplaces could sit outdoors in December and not feel the cold. It was, by any measure, a consolation prize. It was also, for the first time in 20 years, a life that was not being managed by someone else. In Milan, shortly before settling at the Via d'Este, Caroline had hired an Italian ex-soldier named Bartolomeo Pergami. He was tall, handsome, and married, though his wife was not in evidence and would not be mentioned again. He was hired initially as a table waiter, a servant in the formal hierarchy of Caroline's household, whose duties involved standing behind her chair at dinner and carrying plates from the kitchen. Within months he'd been promoted to chamberlain, the head of the household, responsible for managing the staff, the finances, and the daily administration of the villa. Within a year she had purchased an estate for him in Italy, a property substantial enough to sustain a family. She created an unofficial chivalric order, the Order of St. Caroline, and made Pergami its Grand Master, a title that carried no authority outside her own household, but that she bestowed with the ceremony of someone who believed, or wanted to believe, that she still had the power to confer honours. His mother was given rooms in the villa. His sister was appointed to Caroline's staff. His brother was found a position. The original English servants, the ones who had crossed the Channel with her, who had served her at Blackheath, who spoke her language and understood the protocols of a British royal household, quietly departed one by one, until the household at the Villa d'Este was almost entirely Italian and almost entirely Pergami's family. Lord Byron, who was living in Italy at the time, and who was himself not unfamiliar with the territory of public scandal, later noted in his letters that he assumed the relationship to be what most people assumed it to be. Whether Caroline and Pergami were lovers is, in the end, a question that the historical record cannot conclusively answer. It can say that they shared a household. It can say that they travelled together, ate together, appeared in public together, and behaved in ways that multiple observers described as intimate. It can say that the man's rise from waiter to Grand Master of a private order of chivalry in the space of 18 months was not, by any conventional assessment, a career trajectory that owed itself entirely to his administrative abilities. What it cannot say is that any of this was unusual, by the standards of the man she was still legally married to. George had maintained a series of mistresses throughout their marriage, beginning with Lady Jersey, and continuing through a succession of women whose names were known to the court, and whose presence in his household was not concealed. The difference, the only difference, was that George's relationships carried no legal consequence, and Caroline's did. Under the law, a queen's adultery was not a private matter. It was a matter of state, and under the Treason Act of 1351, it was still, technically, a capital offence. I keep returning to that asymmetry. A man whose adultery was documented, public and continuous for 30 years, and a woman whose possible adultery was investigated, tried, and nearly used to destroy her. While Caroline was in Italy, living at the Villa d'Este, entertaining guests, walking the terraces above the lake, raising William Austin in a climate that was kinder to both of them than England had been, her daughter was growing up in London. Charlotte was 21 years old in the autumn of 1817. She had married the year before, Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a minor German prince, in a match that was, by the dismal standards of royal marriages in this period, something close to a love match. They had chosen each other, or as close to choosing as two people in their positions could come. They lived at Claremont House in Surrey, a country estate set back from the road in Parkland, with high ceilings and large windows and the kind of quiet that comes from being genuinely far from anyone who wishes to observe you. It was as far from the court as Charlotte could get without leaving England. She was pregnant. The child was expected in November. The nursery had been prepared. The physicians had been engaged. Everything was in order, or appeared to be. The labour began on the 3rd of November 1817. It lasted 50 hours. 50 hours is more than 2 full days. It is a length of time that, in modern obstetric practice, would have prompted intervention many hours earlier, forceps, or a surgical delivery, or any of the procedures that were by then available, but that Charlotte's physician, Sir Richard Croft, chose not to use. He had decided, on grounds that made sense within the medical thinking of the time, but that have been questioned by every historian of the case since, that nature should be allowed to take its course. Nature took its course. On the 5th of November, after 50 hours, Charlotte delivered a stillborn son. The child was dead. Charlotte appeared to recover. She ate something. She spoke to Leopold. And then, in the early hours of the 6th of November, she began to hemorrhage. The bleeding could not be stopped. Charlotte died before morning. Sir Richard Croft, the physician who had refused to intervene, was widely blamed. He did not defend himself publicly. 3 months later, while attending another difficult birth, he left the room and killed himself. Caroline was in Italy when her daughter died. She was at the Villa d'Este, or on the road somewhere between the villa and one of the other houses she'd been using that autumn. The news did not come by letter from the royal household. George did not write to her. Nobody in the government wrote to her. She learned that her only child was dead from a passing courier, a traveller on the road who was carrying the news as part of the general circulation of information across Europe, and who had no reason to know that the woman he was speaking to was the dead princess's mother. There is a silence that sits inside that moment, and I do not think I can get all the way around it. How do you tell someone that their daughter is dead when you do not know who they are? A woman standing on a road in Italy, hearing from a stranger that her daughter is dead. A daughter she had not seen in years. A daughter she had not been allowed to raise, had not been allowed to visit without supervision, had not been permitted to influence or advise or comfort. A daughter who had grown up in rooms that Caroline could enter only as a guest, and who had died in a house that Caroline had never seen, attended by a physician that Caroline had no say in choosing. The law of coverture, which had been a quiet legal abstraction when Caroline first arrived in England, and which had become a daily fact during the years at Blackheath, the law that gave a father absolute custody, that absorbed a wife's legal identity into her husband's, had produced this. A mother who did not know her daughter was dead because nobody was required to tell her, and because the man who controlled the flow of information between the Crown and the world had decided that she did not need to be told. Charlotte's death changed the succession. She had been the heir presumptive to the British throne, the only legitimate grandchild of King George III. With her death, the succession was suddenly alarmingly open. George III's remaining unmarried sons, there were several of them, most of them middle-aged, most of them living openly with mistresses, most of them comfortably settled into lives that did not include legitimate wives or legitimate children, were suddenly under immense pressure to marry and produce heirs. The pressure was not subtle. It came from the government, from the press, from the church, and from the simple arithmetic of dynastic survival. If no legitimate heir was produced, the Hanoverian line would end. 4 of them rushed into marriages within a year of Charlotte's death. The scramble was undignified, urgent, and transparent in its purpose. Engagements were announced within weeks. Weddings were conducted with minimal ceremony. The brides were drawn from the same limited pool of minor German princesses that had produced Caroline herself. And the child who was eventually born from one of those hastily arranged marriages, the daughter of Edward, Duke of Kent, and Victoria of Saxe-Coburg, born on the 24th of May 1819, was the future Queen Victoria. The longest reigning monarch in British history, until the present day, existed because Charlotte died in a room where her physician chose not to use forceps. Charlotte's coffin was placed in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The nation mourned her with an intensity that surprised the government, and that made George, for the first time, genuinely unpopular. Charlotte had been beloved. She had been warm and direct, and recognisably her mother's daughter, in ways that the court had tried for years to prevent. The public had seen in Charlotte the kind of queen they wanted, open, unaffected, human, and now she was gone, and the man who had separated her from her mother was still on the throne. 2 years later, on the 29th of January 1820, King George III died. The Prince Regent became King George IV, and Caroline, still in Italy, still living at the Via d'Este, still walking the terraces above the lake, with William Austen beside her, was, by every law that governed the country, automatically Queen of England. George's first act as king was to instruct his government to remove her name from the Church of England's official prayers for the royal family. The Liturgy, the standard prayer that was read in every Church of England service, in every church in the country, every Sunday, named the King, the Queen, and the royal family. It was not a grand political statement. It was a line in a prayer. But it was spoken aloud in every parish, every week, and it was the one moment in the routine life of ordinary English people when the existence of the Queen was formally acknowledged. George wanted that line removed. He wanted the country to stop saying her name. Parliament debated it. The debate was public, and it was ugly, and it forced every member of Parliament to take a side on a question that most of them would have preferred to avoid. Did the Queen of England exist or not? The government argued that the prayers were a matter of royal prerogative. The opposition argued that removing the Queen's name from the national liturgy was an act of political erasure that had no legal basis. The debate went on for days in both houses, and at its core was a question that was not really about prayer at all, but about whether the law meant what it said. She existed. The law was clear. The marriage had not been dissolved. There had been no divorce, no annulment, no act of Parliament ending the union. Caroline was Queen, whether George acknowledged it or not, whether the prayers named her or not, whether the doors of the palace were open to her or not. But being Queen in law and being Queen in fact were not the same thing, and the distance between them, the distance that had started with a portrait in Brunswick and had widened with every year since, was about to become the subject of the most extraordinary legal proceeding in British parliamentary history. While she was in Italy, Caroline did not know that the machinery was already being assembled. The Prince Regent, now King, had commissioned what became known as the Milan Commission, a team of agents sent to Italy to collect evidence of Caroline's conduct. The agents were lawyers, diplomats, and investigators, and they operated with the resources of the British government behind them. They moved through the towns where Caroline had stayed. They interviewed innkeepers, servants, coachmen, and anyone who'd been in a position to observe the household at the Villa d'Este. They hired witnesses. They paid for testimony. They assembled a dossier in boxes of sworn statements and signed depositions, documenting what they described as adulterous intercourse between Caroline and Bartolomeo Pergami. The physical archive was substantial. Boxes of documents, hundreds of pages of testimony, witness statements taken in Italian, translated into English, sworn before magistrates, the kind of evidentiary machinery that a state deploys when it wants to destroy someone and needs the destruction to look procedural. The investigation was conducted in secret, without Caroline's knowledge, without her right of reply, and without any communication from the man who'd ordered it, the same man who had not written to tell her that their daughter was dead. The dossier would follow her back to England. The boxes of testimony would be opened in the House of Lords, and the trial that nobody wanted and everybody feared was about to begin. Caroline returned to England in June of 1820. She had been gone for 6 years. She landed at Dover on a summer day, stepping off a ship from Calais onto English ground for the first time since 1814, and what met her there was not the cold, formal welcome she had received 25 years earlier at Greenwich. No rows of naval pensioners, no damp quay, no Lady Jersey waiting in a carriage. What met her was a crowd, a large crowd, a crowd that had come to Dover specifically to see the Queen arrive, and that cheered her off the ship and through the town with a warmth and a volume that no one in the government had anticipated. The harbour was full. The cliffs above were lined with people. She had crossed the sea again, as she had crossed it in 1795, but this time the country on the other side wanted her. The cheering did not stop at Dover. It followed her along the road to London, through Canterbury, through the towns and villages of Kent, gathering force as it went. People came out of their houses, people lined the road. People who had no particular reason to care about the personal difficulties of a German princess they had never met came out to stand in the road and shout their support for a woman they understood correctly to be on the wrong end of a system that was designed to protect the powerful from the consequences of their own behaviour. When the carriage reached London, the scale of it changed. Thousands of people lined the streets. The noise, the constant human roar of a crowd in early 19th century London, mixed with cart horses, iron wheels on stone, street vendors, and bells, was audible streets away. Inside the carriage, the sound would have changed as they approached. First silence from distance, then a growing noise, then individual voices becoming distinguishable, then the carriage door opening into the full force of a city that had come out to see her. At some point during the procession, the crowd unhitched the horses from Caroline's carriage and pulled it through the streets themselves. This was not a spontaneous gesture of enthusiasm. It was a recognized act of tribute in this period, an assertion that the person inside the carriage was worth more than horses, that the crowd valued her more than the animals paid to carry her. The men who pulled the carriage were working men, tradesmen, labourers, people whose lives bore no resemblance to the life of the woman inside, but who understood, in the particular way that the English public of this period understood such things, that what was being done to her was wrong, and that the wrongness was not personal but structural. It was deliberate, it was political, and it terrified the government. The government had a problem, and the problem was constitutional. Caroline was queen. The marriage had not been ended. The law said what it said. And the king wanted her gone, not merely separated, not merely ignored, not merely removed from the prayers, but legislatively destroyed. He wanted the marriage dissolved and the title stripped. He wanted her to stop being queen. The difficulty was that the ordinary mechanism for ending a marriage, a parliamentary divorce, which required a private act of Parliament, was not available to him. A standard parliamentary divorce was already the most expensive and exclusive legal procedure in England. It required 3 stages: an ecclesiastical court proceeding, a civil action for criminal conversation, and then the private act itself. The costs ran to thousands of pounds. The process was available only to the wealthiest families in the country, and it required the husband to prove his wife's adultery, but the proceedings also opened the door to the examination of the husband's own conduct. George's conduct was not merely imperfect, it was catastrophic. His adultery was documented, continuous, and well known to every person in England who could read a newspaper. His prior illegal marriage to Maria Fitzherbert was a matter of public record, however vigorously it had been denied. The woman he had married in secret was still alive. The clergyman who had performed the ceremony had been paid off. The witnesses had been sworn to silence, but the evidence existed, and Henry Brougham held it, and if a standard divorce proceeding were initiated, Brougham would deploy every piece of it. The result would be not merely embarrassing, but constitutionally dangerous, because it would force into the open the question of whether the King of England had committed bigamy. So the government chose a different instrument. In July of 1820, the Bill of Pains and Penalties was introduced into the House of Lords. It was not a divorce petition. It was not a criminal prosecution. It was a legislative act, a bill that, if passed, would dissolve the royal marriage and strip Caroline of her title by Act of Parliament. The Lords would serve as both judge and jury. Witnesses would be called, sworn and cross-examined. Evidence would be presented. But the outcome would not be a verdict in the ordinary legal sense. It would be a vote. The peers of the realm would vote on whether to end a marriage, and the standard of proof required was whatever the peers decided it was. The bill required 3 readings to pass, like any other legislation. Each reading was a vote. Between readings, witnesses were examined and cross-examined at a bar set up at one end of the chamber, in a process that resembled a criminal trial, but was governed by the rules of parliamentary procedure rather than the rules of evidence. The accused, Caroline, was not required to be present. She was not in fact permitted to sit in the chamber while the proceedings took place. The Queen of England was being tried by Parliament and was not allowed in the room. This had never happened before. No Parliament in the entire history of Britain had ever convened to function as a divorce tribunal for a reigning monarch. No equivalent proceeding had been attempted, and none has been attempted since. The Bill of Pains and Penalties was, in the most literal sense, a constitutional experiment, an attempt to solve a political problem using a legal instrument that had never been designed for the purpose, and that nobody was entirely sure would work. The proceedings lasted 4 months, from July to November of 1820. The House of Lords met repeatedly. The Chamber, a formal space of peers in wigs and robes, counsel at the bar, witnesses sworn and cross-examined, was packed for the first time in anyone's memory with press reporters. The gallery was frequently noisy enough to require the Lord Chancellor to call for order. The atmosphere was not that of a legislative chamber conducting routine business. It was the atmosphere of a theatre, and everyone in the room knew it, and the audience outside was larger than any theatre in London could hold. The witnesses against Caroline were, almost without exception, Italian. They were servants, attendants, and employees who'd been gathered by the Milan Commission. The same team of agents who'd assembled the dossier in Italy. They testified, through interpreters, about what they claimed to have seen at the Via d'Este: sleeping arrangements, physical proximity, doors that were locked, beds that were shared. The testimony was detailed, intimate, and, in the hands of Caroline's counsel, extremely vulnerable to cross-examination. Caroline's lead counsel was Henry Brougham. He was a Whig lawyer, a politician, a man of formidable intelligence, and no particular scruples about how that intelligence was deployed. Brougham held documented evidence of George IV's own adulterous history, including the illegal prior marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, and he made it known, openly and without ambiguity, that he would deploy every piece of it if the proceedings continued. The threat was not veiled. It was not diplomatic. It was the legal equivalent of standing in a room full of people and lighting a match next to the curtains. During the trial, Brougham made a statement that has outlasted the trial itself, outlasted Caroline, outlasted George, and entered the permanent literature of legal ethics. He said that an advocate, in the discharge of his duty, knows but one person in all the world, and that person is his client. The statement was delivered in the House of Lords to an audience of peers who understood that the client in question was the Queen of England, and that the advocate in question was prepared to destroy the king to defend her. The statement is still cited in law schools in Britain and America. Brougham meant every word of it. The Lords believed him. Brougham's cross-examination of the Italian witnesses was devastating. He dismantled their testimony in public, demonstrating inconsistencies in their accounts, exposing the payments they had received from the Milan Commission, and drawing from them admissions that made the gallery laugh. One witness, questioned about the layout of rooms at the Via d'Este, contradicted his own earlier testimony about which doors led where. Another could not remember the dates of events he had described in vivid detail. A third, pressed on the question of how much money he had been paid for his testimony, gave an answer that was demonstrably false and had to be corrected by his own counsel. The laughter in the gallery was not polite. It was the laughter of people watching an expensive legal proceeding fall apart in real time. The laughter was important. A proceeding that was meant to look grave and judicial was beginning to look vindictive and absurd, and the peers who would vote on the bill could hear the laughter as clearly as anyone. The Italian witnesses had been brought to England at considerable expense. They had been housed, fed, coached, and presented as the centrepiece of the government's case, and they were being taken apart one by a lawyer who understood that the best way to defeat testimony is not to deny it, but to make it look ridiculous. Outside the chamber, London was demonstrating. The demonstrations had begun before the trial started and continued throughout its duration, week after week, growing larger as the proceedings dragged on. Processions of 50,000 people were documented in September of 1820, columns of men and women and children moving through the streets of central London in organised marches that stretched for miles. Over 800 separate petitions in Caroline's favour were submitted to Parliament, bearing nearly 1 million signatures. The signatures were real. The petitions were physical objects, sheets of paper and parchment, signed by hand, carried to Parliament by delegations from every county in England. On one occasion, crowds numbering 100,000 were reported near Piccadilly. The sound of these crowds, the constant human roar, mixed with the noise of carts and horses and the shouts of political sloganeering, carried into the streets around Parliament and made the air outside the Lords' Chamber feel like a different country from the chamber itself. 1 million signatures in 1820 in a country with a total population of roughly 12 million. That is not a petition. That is a census of outrage. The Queen Caroline affair, as it became known, was not merely a domestic scandal played out in public. It became a significant radicalising event for Britain's reform movement. This was barely a year after the Peterloo massacre of 1819, when cavalry had charged a crowd of 60,000 people at a political rally in Manchester, killing 15 and injuring hundreds. The reformers who had survived Peterloo, the organisers, the pamphleteers, the journalists, the working men and women who had stood in a field and been ridden down by soldiers on horseback, recognised in Caroline's trial a template for the kind of public pressure that could force a government to retreat. The affair taught them how to organise large-scale petitioning campaigns, how to coordinate demonstrations across multiple cities, how to use press coverage to shape public debate. The tools were transferable. The organisational skills developed in defence of a queen they would never meet were the same skills that would be deployed, a decade later, in defence of their own right to vote. Henry Brougham himself, the advocate who had defended Caroline in the Lords, later became a key figure in the reform movement that produced the Great Reform Act of 1832, the legislation that began the slow, incomplete process of making Parliament representative of the country it governed. Caroline's trial had a long tail. The tools developed to defend her were later used to build a different kind of Britain. The Bill of Pains and Penalties passed its third reading in the House of Lords by a margin of 9 votes. 9 votes in a chamber of several hundred peers. The margin was so thin, and the prospect of the bill passing the House of Commons so remote, and the scale of the public demonstration so alarming, that the government withdrew the bill in November of 1820. It would not be put to the Commons. Caroline had won. She had won in the sense that the bill was withdrawn, that her title was preserved, that the marriage was not dissolved by Act of Parliament. She had won in the sense that the constitutional machinery assembled to destroy her had failed to do so. She remained queen in title, in law, and in the understanding of a public that had poured into the streets to defend her. But the government had something else to offer. It offered her £50,000 a year as a formal, written bribe to leave England permanently, to renounce her claim to be treated as queen, and to disappear from public life. £50,000 a year was, in 1820, the equivalent of roughly 1,000 years of a skilled craftsman's wages. It was more money than most families in England would see in a dozen generations. It was a sum designed to make refusal irrational. The offer was made in writing, and her refusal was also in writing. Both documents exist in the historical record. She would not take the money. She would not leave. She was queen, and she intended to be treated as one. The coronation was approaching. George was determined to be crowned. Caroline was determined to be present, and the government, having failed to remove her by law and having failed to remove her by bribery, was left with one remaining option. It could put soldiers at the doors of Westminster Abbey and simply not let her in. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think it matters what Caroline knew, and when she knew it, and what she chose to do with what she knew. She knew the trial had not ended the hostility. She knew the bill had been withdrawn not because the Lords believed her innocent, but because the margin was too thin and the streets too full. She knew that the government's offer of £50,000 a year was not generosity, but a final attempt to make her disappear, and that her refusal had made her a problem that could no longer be solved quietly. She knew, or must have known, that the coronation would not be a welcome. She went anyway. I have thought about this. I have thought about what it means to wake up on a July morning in London in 1821, knowing that the doors of Westminster Abbey will almost certainly be closed to you, knowing that soldiers have been posted, knowing that your husband, the king, the man whose debts you were brought across the sea to pay, has spent more money on this single day than your father's duchy earned in a year, and knowing that none of it is for you, and going anyway. There is a version of Caroline that is easy to dismiss. She was loud. She was impulsive. She did not read the room. She kept a man in her house in Italy who was almost certainly her lover, and behaved as though the world owed her the right not to be judged for it. She adopted a child from a dockworker's family and held him on her lap in front of guests. She created a chivalric order with one member. She wore the wrong clothes. She said the wrong things. She was, by every measure that the court used to judge a woman in her position, unsuitable. But she also refused to accept that unsuitable meant invisible. She refused the money. She refused the silence. She refused the careful, negotiated disappearance that would have made everyone's life easier, everyone's except hers. And on the morning of July the 19th, 1821, she got into a carriage and rode to Westminster Abbey, not because she believed the doors would open, but because she believed they should. I do not know what to call that. Is it courage? Not exactly, because courage implies a reasonable expectation of success, and Caroline had no such expectation. It is not exactly defiance, because defiance implies anger, and what Caroline showed on that morning looked less like anger than like a simple, unshakable conviction that she had the right to be there. Maybe what I am describing is stubbornness. Maybe it is foolishness. Maybe it is something that does not have a clean name, something that sits between dignity and desperation, and is better understood by seeing it clearly than by naming it precisely. She got into the carriage. She rode to Westminster, and for the last time in her life, she knocked on a door that belonged, in law, to her. The coronation of King George IV took place on July the 19th, 1821. It cost approximately £238,000, roughly 25 times what his father's coronation had cost, and more than the annual revenue of several English counties combined. The money had been spent on everything. The abbey had been transformed. Scaffolding erected a gallery for spectators along both sides of the nave. A blue carpet ran the full length of the building. Every pier and column was hung with fabric. crimson and gold, arranged by the College of Heralds according to a scheme that has been planned for months. The stained glass threw coloured light across the stone floor in the early morning, and hundreds of candles had been lit in the chandeliers and sconces, so that the interior of the abbey, when seen through any open door, was awash of warm light and ceremony, the kind of sight that makes people stop and stare, even when they know what they are looking at. The king's crown had been specially commissioned. It contained over 12,000 diamonds, set in a frame of gold, and it caught the candlelight in a way that was visible from the back of the nave. The diamonds were hired, borrowed for the occasion, and returned afterwards, because even a coronation that cost £250,000 did not stretch to the permanent purchase of 12,000 stones. The crown was a temporary object. It glittered like something eternal, and it was given back within the week. George's coronation robe was 16 feet of crimson velvet, embroidered with gold thread, and it required a team of page boys to carry it behind him as he walked. 16 feet is roughly the length of a large room. Underneath the robe he wore layers of ceremonial dress, satin breeches, white stockings, a wig styled in the manner of Stuart-era portraiture, and over all of this, a hat bearing ostrich and heron feathers that added another foot to his height. One contemporary described the overall effect as designed to eclipse Napoleon. Whether it succeeded in this is a matter of opinion. What is not a matter of opinion is that it was, by any standard, a spectacle. The coronation banquet that followed the Abbey service was held in Westminster Hall, the largest surviving medieval hall in England, approximately 240 feet long, with a hammer-beam roof that dated from the 1390s. The hall was laid with long tables, and the guests were served 160 tureens of soup, courses of fish and game and roasted meat, and 9,840 bottles of wine. It was the last coronation banquet ever held in Britain. Every coronation since has omitted this element, as though the country looked at the cost of this one and decided collectively never again. I mention all of this, the diamonds, the robe, the wine, the feathers, because none of it was for Caroline, and because she arrived at Westminster Hall at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning to find that the preparations for the most expensive day in the history of the British monarchy were already underway, and that she was not part of them. £238,000. The woman who had been offered £50,000 a year to disappear, a sum that would take a skilled craftsman 1,000 years to earn, was arriving at a ceremony that had cost nearly 5 times that offer in a single day. The money that could have paid for her silence for almost 5 years had been spent instead on one morning of velvet and diamonds and wine. July in London means full daylight before 5 in the morning. When Caroline's carriage pulled up to Westminster Hall at 6, the sun was already well above the rooftops, and the stone of the hall and the abbey was lit in the particular flat, clear light of an English summer morning, the light that shows every surface, every crack, every face in full detail, with nowhere for anyone to hide. The morning was cool, as July mornings in London tend to be, but the interior of the hall, already packed with hundreds of people preparing for the ceremony, would have been warm and growing warmer. Caroline was travelling with Lord Hood, a naval officer and supporter who'd remained loyal to her throughout the trial and its aftermath. Her party was small, a few attendants, a few loyal friends, the kind of reduced entourage that a woman brings when she knows she may not be welcome but intends to arrive anyway. There was no procession. There were no outriders. There was no advance guard to announce her presence. The carriage simply arrived at Westminster, joined the traffic of other carriages that were delivering guests to the ceremony, and stopped. She was dressed in formal clothes. Accounts describe her outfit as somewhat theatrical, overdressed in a manner that attracted comment, wearing her own version of ceremonial dress as though attending the event she was being excluded from. The dress was elaborate, the hair was arranged, the jewellery was real. She had dressed for a coronation, she had dressed as though she were the Queen. Because she was the Queen, and if the mourning was going to humiliate her, she had decided that it would not do so because she had failed to prepare. She approached the first door. The door was guarded. The official at the door, a functionary of the College of Heralds responsible for managing admission to the ceremony, asked her for a ticket. A ticket. The Queen of England, arriving at her husband's coronation, at the abbey where queens had been crowned for 800 years, was asked to produce a piece of paper confirming her right to be present, as though she were attending the theatre, as though the ceremony happening inside the building had nothing to do with her, as though the word Queen on the official's own invitation list referred to someone else. She replied that she was the Queen and did not require one. She was turned away. She moved to another entrance, the East Cloister. She got back into the carriage, drove around the building, stopped, got out, walked to the door. The same question, the same answer, the same refusal. She moved again. The West Cloister. The same pattern. A door, a guard, a request for a ticket she did not have and should not have needed. A refusal, and then back into the carriage, and then another door. The carriage moved around the perimeter of the abbey and the hall, stopping at each entrance, and at each entrance the scene was the same. The stone walls of the abbey are thick. The doors are heavy oak, set in pointed arches, built to last centuries. At each one a man stood with instructions. The instructions were clear. The orders had been given. The Queen was not to be admitted. Think about the geometry of this for a moment. A woman in a carriage circling a building, stopping at door after door, getting out, being refused, getting back in. The building is enormous. Westminster Hall and the Abbey together form one of the largest architectural complexes in London. The distance between entrances is not trivial. Each attempt took time. Each refusal was witnessed by a different section of the crowd. The humiliation was not a single moment. It was repeated and repeated and repeated in a slow circuit around the stone walls of a building that belonged to her. The crowd outside the abbey was large and divided. Some of them cheered her. Some of them, and this was new and it mattered, booed. Caroline's popularity, which had been immense during the trial, which had filled the streets with 100,000 people and produced 1 million signatures, had begun to erode. The public had supported her against the bill, but the bill was gone, and what remained was a woman who would not take the money and would not leave, and who was now, on a summer morning, being turned away from door after door in front of a crowd that was no longer entirely sure whose side it was on. The booing was not universal. The cheering was louder. But the fact that it existed at all, that some of the people watching the Queen of England being refused entry to her own coronation were jeering rather than protesting, tells you something about how quickly the ground can shift beneath a person who has no institutional support and whose only authority is the sympathy of strangers. At one entrance, the accounts vary on which one, but the moment itself is documented by multiple eyewitnesses. The pages at the door briefly obeyed her. She called out. She said the words that have come down through the accounts. The Queen, open. And the pages, who were young men whose job was to open and close doors on command, opened the door. For a moment, a few seconds, no more, the door was open. Through it, Caroline would have seen the interior of the abbey or the hall, lit by candles and stained glass, hung with crimson and gold, filled with the peers and bishops and officials who were assembling for the ceremony. She would have seen the blue carpet running the length of the nave. She would have seen the scaffolded galleries, packed with spectators in formal dress, and the altar at the far end prepared for the anointing. She would have felt the change in air, the warm interior pressing outward into the cool morning, carrying with it the smell of beeswax candles and hundreds of bodies, and the particular smell of old stone that has been closed up and heated. She would have heard, for a moment, the murmur of conversation inside the building, the rustle of fabric, the sound of a crowd that was settled and waiting and had no idea that the Queen was standing at the door. She would have seen, for a fraction of a moment, the inside of the event from which she was being excluded, the warm light, the ceremony, the world that the law said was hers and that every person in the room had agreed to pretend was not. And then an official, a man whose name the accounts do not consistently record, but whose authority was clear, spoke. He said two things. He said, "Do your duty." And he said, "Shut the door." The pages shut the door. The sound of a large wooden door closing in a stone building is not a small sound. In a building like the Abbey, where the walls are 3 feet thick and the ceiling vaults carry sound upward and outward, the closing of a heavy oak door produces a deep resonant thud that echoes for a second or two before the stone absorbs it. It is the kind of sound that lands in the chest before the ear makes sense of it. In the July morning air, with the crowd watching and the carriage waiting, and the woman standing on the wrong side of the stone wall, the sound of the door being shut was the sound of something ending. Not just the mourning, not just the attempt to enter the coronation, something larger than that, and quieter and harder to name. The silence that followed was the silence of a crowd that had just watched the Queen of England be shut out of her own coronation by a servant following orders. It lasted a moment. Then the noise returned, the cheering, the booing, the sounds of the street. But the silence had been there, and everyone who was present had heard it. Caroline stood on the wrong side of the door. She had crossed to sea for this country. She had married a man who asked for brandy at the sight of her. She had been watched by his mistress, investigated by his commission, tried by his parliament, and offered his money to disappear. She had refused, and now she was standing outside a stone wall, in her best clothes, in the early light of a July morning, and the door was shut. She tried one more entrance. She was turned away again, and then, and this is the part that I think about most often, she got back into the carriage. She did not shout. She did not force her way in. She did not create the kind of scene that her enemies had probably expected, and that would have given them the justification they needed to call her undignified. She simply got back into the carriage, and the driver turned the horses, and the carriage drove away from Westminster, through the streets of a city that was preparing to celebrate a coronation she had not been permitted to attend, past the crowds who were still arriving, past the carriages of the people who had been given tickets, past the soldiers at the gates who'd been told to keep her out, and she went home. She went home. The Queen of England went home, because the doors of her own coronation were shut in her face, and there was nowhere else to go. She went to Brandenburg House in Hammersmith, a riverside house on the Thames that belonged to someone else, and that she was staying in because she had no London residence of her own. The Queen of England did not own a house. The coronation proceeded without her. George was crowned. The Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown on his head, the crown of 12,000 hired diamonds, and the peers of the realm shouted, "God save the King," and the trumpets sounded and the abbey filled with the noise of ceremony, the noise that Caroline had heard for a fraction of a second, through an open door before it was shut. The banquet was held. The 9,840 bottles of wine were opened. The king's champion, a man in full plate armour, mounted on a war horse, riding into Westminster Hall in a medieval tradition that had been performed at every coronation since Richard II, threw down his gauntlet and challenged any man present to deny the king's right to rule. Nobody accepted the challenge. The champion withdrew. The king drank from a golden cup. The ceremony ended. The cost was entered into the government's accounts. The hired diamonds were returned. Caroline was not mentioned. She was not toasted. She was not named in the prayers, and she was not present in the hall, and the seat that should have been hers, the Queen's seat at the right hand of the king, was empty or occupied by someone else, or simply not there. 26 years of marriage, and the man in the 16-foot robe had arranged for his wife to be erased from every element of the day. 19 days later, she was dead. But before we reach her death, I want to hold the image a moment longer. The carriage driving away from Westminster, the streets filling with people who are not there for her, the sound of the crowd behind her, growing quieter as the carriage turns a corner and moves east along the river toward Hammersmith, toward a house that is not hers, toward the last 19 days of her life, the morning light on the Thames, the city going on without her. A woman in a carriage, in her best clothes, riding away from a closed door. Brandenburg House stood on the north bank of the Thames in Hammersmith, roughly 4 miles west of Westminster. It was a substantial property, a large house with grounds running down to the river, with rooms enough for a household, with views across the water to the Surrey bank. But it was not a palace. It was not a royal residence. It was not hers. It was someone else's house that she was staying in, because the Queen of England, after 26 years of marriage to the King, did not possess a London home of her own. The houses she'd lived in, Montague House at Blackheath, the various properties she'd occupied during the years of the delicate investigation and the years of exile, had all been arranged for her, managed by other people, and subject to the approval of a husband who controlled, by law, every piece of property she might otherwise have called her own. She arrived at Brandenburg House on the morning of July the 19th, 1821, having been turned away from every entrance to Westminster Abbey. What happened inside the house that morning is not recorded in detail. The accounts tell us that she was unwell. Some sources say she complained of abdominal pain on the journey home. Others say the illness came later that day, or the day after. What is clear is that from the 20th of July onward, the day after the coronation, Caroline's health deteriorated rapidly. The illness was severe. She suffered acute abdominal pain, nausea, and a progressive weakening that confined her to her bed within days. The rooms at Brandenburg House were large but unfamiliar. Not the room she'd furnished, not the room she had chosen, not the rooms where her books or her paintings or her possessions were arranged in the particular way that a person arranges things when a space is truly theirs. The doctors came and went. The servants attended her. William Austin, the boy from Deptford, now a young man, was in the house, though the accounts do not say whether he was allowed in the room. The Thames ran past outside the windows as it always did, carrying the traffic of the city toward the sea. Her physicians diagnosed an intestinal obstruction, though the precise nature of the condition was never established with certainty, because Caroline refused to submit to a post-mortem examination. She had spent her adult life being examined by commissions, by Parliament, by the press, by the court. The delicate investigation had examined her motherhood. The Milan Commission had examined her bedroom. The Bill of Pains and Penalties had examined her marriage. She had been examined, in public, by the most powerful institutions in the country, and she chose in her final days not to be examined again. Her body, at least, would remain her own. The days passed. The 19th of July became the 20th. The 20th became the 25th. The 25th became the 1st of August. Each day the pain was worse. Each day the weakness was greater. Each day the house on the Thames grew quieter, as the visitors who had come in the first days, the supporters, the politicians, the curious, stopped coming, and the household contracted to its essential shape, a woman in a bed in someone else's house, dying. Contemporary accounts of her death are divided between the clinical and the sentimental. The clinical accounts describe the progression of symptoms, the pain, the fever, the weakness, in the detached language of medical observation. The sentimental accounts said she had died of vexation, that the humiliation of the coronation morning had broken something inside her that could not be repaired, that the door shut in her face had been a blow from which she did not recover. Neither account is entirely satisfying. The medical evidence points to a physical cause. The timing, 19 days between the closed door and the death, points to something that medicine alone cannot explain. Rumours of poisoning circulated widely and were never substantiated. They arose because the timing was convenient for the king, because the symptoms were ambiguous, and because the public, having watched 26 years of systematic cruelty, was not inclined to give the crown the benefit of the doubt. The rumour said that something had been put in her food, or in her medicine, or in the wine she drank at the theatre on the evening of the coronation. The rumour said that the same government that had hired witnesses in Italy and posted soldiers at the doors of the Abbey was capable of something quieter and more final. There was no evidence. There has never been evidence. But the rumours persisted because they fitted the pattern of what had already been done to her, and because in a story where the Crown had already demonstrated, repeatedly, that it would use any available instrument to remove Caroline from public life, the possibility of one more instrument did not seem, to the people who loved her, unreasonable. Whether Caroline was poisoned is a question that the historical record cannot answer, and that I will not pretend to resolve. What the record can say is that she was dying, and that she knew she was dying, and that in the days she had left she made two decisions that outlasted her. The first decision was about her coffin. She chose the inscription herself. She dictated the words or wrote them, or communicated them to the people around her, with sufficient clarity that the instruction was carried out exactly as she intended. The inscription read, "Caroline, the injured Queen of England." 6 words. She'd spent 26 years in a country that had debated her existence, investigated her conduct, tried her in Parliament, offered her money to disappear, and shut the doors of her own coronation in her face. She had been called unsuitable, undignified, immoral, loud and foreign. She had been separated from her daughter, exiled from the court, and erased from the national prayers. And in the end, with whatever strength she had left, she chose 6 words to place on the lid of her coffin. And the words she chose were not a defence, not an explanation, not an apology. They were a verdict. Injured, not destroyed, not defeated, not wronged, which would have implied complaint, and not innocent, which would have invited argument. Injured. The word carries the weight of something that was done to her, not something she did. It is a word that points outward at the people who caused the injury without naming them. It is a word that a lawyer would choose, or a queen, or a woman who had learned, over 26 years, the difference between the two. She chose the word injured, and she chose the word queen. and she put them together in a sentence that was designed to outlast every other sentence that had ever been written about her. The words were carved into the lid of the coffin, the physical act of carving, a chisel on wood or an engraver's tool on a metal plate, the letters cut one by one into a surface that would travel across the sea and into the ground, was the last time Caroline's voice would be heard in the world. She made it count. It worked. 200 years later, the inscription is the first thing most people learn about Caroline of Brunswick. The 6 words on the coffin have outlasted the 9-vote margin in the Lords, the 1 million signatures on the petitions, the £238,000 spent on the coronation, and the 12,000 hired diamonds. She chose her last words carefully, and they carried. Caroline died on the 7th of August, 1821. She was 53 years old. She had been Queen of England for 18 months, and had been permitted to exercise no part of the role. She died at Brandenburg House, in someone else's house, on the bank of a river that ran through a city that had pulled her carriage through its streets, and had then watched, from the pavement, as the doors were shut. George IV, her husband, did not attend the funeral. He did not send a representative. He did not issue a public statement of condolence. He did not order the court into mourning. He was, at the time of Caroline's death, in Ireland, a royal visit that had been planned before her illness, and that he did not curtail or postpone. The Queen of England was dying, and the King of England was in Dublin, attending banquets and receiving addresses from the Irish Parliament, and he did not come back. This was consistent with his behaviour throughout the marriage. After their formal separation in 1796, 25 years before her death, George had never once spoken to Caroline directly. Not a word, not in person, not by letter, not through any channel that could be described as personal communication. Their only contact had been through intermediaries, solicitors, and government officials. For a quarter of a century, 2 people who were legally married, who produced a child together, who had stood beside each other in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace and exchanged vows before the Archbishop of Canterbury, had not exchanged a single word. 26 years of marriage, and the closest they came to conversation after 1796 was the door that was shut in her face at Westminster Abbey. The second decision Caroline made in her final days was about her body. She wanted to be buried in Brunswick, in the duchy where she'd been born, in the country she'd left as a young woman to marry a prince who had been drunk at her wedding. She did not want to be buried in England. England had been the country of her marriage, her exile, her investigation, her trial, and her humiliation. Brunswick had been home. She wanted to go home. The government, having failed to control Caroline in life, attempted to control her funeral. The procession through London was deliberately rerouted to avoid the city centre, to keep the coffin out of the streets where the demonstrations had been held, away from the places where the crowds had gathered, far from any route that might allow her death to become, like her trial, a political event. The crowds blocked the route anyway. Mourners and supporters turned out in large numbers and physically prevented the coffin from following the government's prescribed path. The barriers were moved, the horses were turned, the procession was forced through central London despite the official plan, through the very streets that the government had tried to avoid, through the streets where the demonstrations had been held, past the buildings where the petitions had been signed, along the roads where 1 million people had put their names to the demand that Parliament leave their Queen alone. Troops were deployed, cavalry. the same kind of cavalry that had ridden into the crowd at Peterloo 2 years earlier. There were clashes between the mourners and the soldiers, the same kind of confrontation that had marked the demonstrations during the trial, the same kind of violence that had characterized every moment when the public sympathy for Caroline collided with the government's desire to make her disappear. Shots were fired. 2 people were killed. 2 mourners who had come to escort the coffin of their queen and who died on a London street because the government did not want the coffin to pass through the centre of the city. The coffin made its way through a city that was, one last time, refusing to let Caroline be erased quietly. Even in death, the Crown could not move her body through London without bloodshed. The coffin reached the coast. It was loaded onto a ship. It crossed the sea, the same crossing in reverse that Caroline had made 26 years earlier when she'd left Brunswick as a young bride and arrived at Greenwich to find a husband who needed brandy to face her. The ship sailed east, across the North Sea, toward a country that Caroline had not seen since 1795, and that had changed almost beyond recognition in the intervening years. Her father's duchy had been conquered by Napoleon, occupied, restored, and reshaped by the Congress of Vienna. The palace where she'd grown up was still standing, but the court she had known was gone. The coffin was carried through the streets of Brunswick to the ducal vault, to the place where the Dukes of Brunswick had been buried for generations, beneath the floor of a chapel that smelled of stone and cold air and the accumulated silence of centuries. The lid bore 6 words: Caroline, the injured Queen of England. She'd left this city as a bride. She returned as a coffin inscription. The journey was complete. Lady Jersey, Frances Villiers, Countess of Jersey, the woman who had been George's mistress before and during and after the wedding, the woman who'd been placed in Caroline's household as a lady-in-waiting, the woman who had whispered and watched and made the first year of the marriage a daily performance of humiliation, died in the same year as Caroline, 1821. Upon her death, her executor followed her instructions and destroyed her papers, the letters from the Prince of Wales, the correspondence that would have documented in the prince's own hand the private arrangements of the marriage, the affair, and the deliberate cruelty, were burned. The content is permanently lost. The woman who knew most about what had been done to Caroline arranged for that knowledge to die with her. Maria Fitzherbert, the Catholic widow whom George had married in secret in 1785, the woman whose existence had made his marriage to Caroline legally necessary and emotionally impossible, the woman he had referred to privately as his true wife throughout his life, outlived all of them. She outlived George, who died in 1830. She outlived Caroline, who died in 1821. She outlived Lady Jersey, who died in the same year. Maria Fitzherbert died in 1837 at the age of 81, having spent half a century as the silent, acknowledged, officially denied centre of a story that had destroyed the woman who replaced her. She was buried with a miniature portrait of George around her neck, because she'd never stopped believing that she was his wife, and because the law, the same law that had made Caroline queen and had denied her the reality of the title, had been just as efficient at denying Maria the reality of hers. Everyone in this story lost. George lost the respect of his country and the capacity to govern it without constant crisis. He died in 1830 at the age of 67, obese, addicted to laudanum, and so unpopular that the Times wrote in his obituary that there never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. He had spent 67 years accumulating debts, mistresses, and enemies, and he left behind a country that was relieved to see him go, the same country that had been relieved 6 years earlier to see his wife go. Caroline lost her daughter, her health, and her life. She lost 26 years to a marriage that was a transaction disguised as a ceremony, and she lost the final 19 days to an illness that may or may not have been connected to the door that was shut in her face. She was 53 years old. She'd been married for 26 of those years and had spent approximately 3 nights under the same roof as her husband. Maria lost the acknowledgement of a marriage she believed was real. She spent 52 years as the woman the king called his true wife, and the law called a stranger. She wore his ring, she kept his portrait. She was buried with a locket containing his miniature around her neck, because she had never stopped believing that she was his wife, and because the law, the same law that had made Caroline queen and had denied her the reality of the title, had been just as efficient at denying Maria the reality of hers. Charlotte lost everything at 21 on a bed at Claremont House where a physician chose not to use forceps. Her son, the child who would have been the heir to the British throne, who would have rendered every other character in this story a footnote, was stillborn. The physician who let her die killed himself 3 months later. The only person in the entire story who was demonstrably innocent was the first to die. Lady Jersey lost her reputation and arranged for the evidence to be burned. William Austin, the boy from Deptford, lost the only mother he had ever known. He was named as the principal beneficiary in Caroline's will, the boy who had been the subject of a government investigation, who had been examined by 4 cabinet ministers to determine whether he was the illegitimate son of a princess, inherited what she left behind. It was not much. Queens who do not own houses do not leave large estates. The law of coverture, the legal framework that had made all of this possible, that had absorbed Caroline's identity into George's on their wedding day, that had given him custody of their child and control of their property, and the power to define unilaterally the terms of her existence, continued in force for decades after Caroline's death. It was not fully dismantled until a series of married women's property acts in the second half of the 19th century began the slow process of recognizing that a woman who married did not, in fact, cease to exist. The first of those acts was passed in 1870, 49 years after Caroline died, 49 years during which every married woman in England lived under the same legal framework that had made Caroline's life what it was. The framework was not an aberration. It was not a quirk of royal life. It was the ordinary law of the land applied to every marriage in the country, and it lasted long enough for Caroline to have become not a cautionary tale, but a footnote. She did not become a footnote. The 6 words saw to that. I said at the beginning that this is the story of a door in a stone wall on a summer morning in London in 1821. The door opens for a moment, a few seconds no more, and through it you can see candlelight and ceremony, blue carpet and gold fabric and the interior of a building where a man is about to be crowned king. And then a voice says, "Shut the door," and the door shuts, and the woman on the other side of it stands there, in the light, in her best clothes, and does not shout, and does not force her way in, and does not do anything except stand there for a moment and then get back into the carriage. The door is still there. Westminster Abbey is still there. The stone wall is still there, and the pointed arch, and the heavy oak, and the iron fittings that have been there since the building was built. If you walk past it on a July morning in the early light, with the sun already up and the Thames running south of Parliament, you can stand where Caroline stood and look at the same stone. The door is closed as it usually is. The street is quiet. The crowd is gone. The carriage is gone. The woman is gone. The official who said shut the door is gone. The pages who obeyed him are gone. The king who ordered the doors closed is gone, buried at Windsor. Remembered primarily for his debts and his appetites and his treatment of his wife. The stone remains, the door remains, and somewhere in Brunswick, in a vault beneath a chapel floor, the 6 words remain. But the 6 words are still legible on a coffin in Brunswick, in a vault beneath a chapel in a German city that most English people have never visited. Caroline, the injured Queen of England. She chose those words, and they carried, and they are still carrying 200 years later, across the sea she crossed twice, once alive, and once in a box with her own verdict written on the lid.